Hello and welcome to my talk on what's new in Perl v5.38. For a while now we've been doing these yearly releases of Perl, where each new version tends to come out sometime around early summer. So this year we got the final release version of v5.38 at the beginning of July, just a few days ago. Before we take a look at what's new in this latest release, let's briefly go back over some of the recent releases and remind ourselves what's been leading up to this point. At Perl v5.34, 2 years ago, we added this new try-catch syntax, which is a nice native syntax for doing this style of exception catching behavior, using these new keywords try and catch. This is based on some experimentation in a CPAN module called syntax keyword try, which is where a lot of the initial design of the idea happened. That allowed us to fine-tune the design, work out what we wanted to do in a CPAN module before we brought it into the core language. This meant that when we did bring it into core Perl, it was pretty much a done design. At Perl 5.36 a year ago, we did pretty much the same thing. We added these defer blocks, which are a way to add bits of code to run when you get to the end of the scope. It's useful for things like cleanup operations because it runs whenever you leave the scope for whatever reason, be it return, throwing an exception, go to, whatever. You can put your cleanup code there and know that it'll always run. This was inspired by another CPAN module, syntax keyword defer, which already implemented that behavior, which meant that when we got around to bringing it into the core Perl language, it was already nicely designed, and all we had to do was copy the same thing. 5.36 also added these finally blocks to try catch, which again was part of the design of the CPAN module that we already had. These are similar to the defer blocks, but just used as part of the try catch syntax. That also took its inspiration from the original CPAN module. Another thing we did in 5.36 was to make subroutine signatures non-experimental. They're now a stable part of the language that doesn't issue experimental warnings anymore, because we're relatively happy that this is a thing that we want to continue to support going forward. So now you can just use v5.38, and you can use this nice subroutine signature syntax for handling parameters into your functions. This at the top here, this use version syntax, I want to draw special attention to. It's been around for a while now in Perl, but lately we're starting to make more use of it, giving it more powerful abilities, letting it do more useful things. It's a nice way to set up a lot of the newer, more modern features all in one go, right away from line one. A lot more of the features going forward in Perl are going to be incorporated into that as well. So it's something you definitely want to be making use of as you write new code. Work out what minimum version of Perl you want to support, put that line in, and that will activate all the latest and greatest stable features for that version of the language, making them all easily available to you. For example, subroutine signatures, as we already see here. What's also nice about this syntax is a couple of additional things that use version does that maybe people didn't realize before. So let's just cover that now. Ever since Perl version 5.12, whenever you write use v5.12 or later, that automatically implies a use strict. So you don't have to put a use strict line at the top of your file. You can just put use v5.12. New in 5.36, this also implies use warnings. So now this one line of use v5.36 can replace two lines of use strict and use warnings. So even if you don't actually use any of the new features, by writing this one use version line, you can save yourself an additional line of code. Moving on to look at Perl 5.38 now, probably the biggest headline feature is this new class syntax. I know a lot of people have been looking at and they've been talking about this already. I've seen a lot of blog posts, Mastodon posts, that kind of thing. People seem very excited about this. But there's also a bunch of other things in there as well that perhaps have flown under the radar of all of that. So we'll take a look at some of those as well. We've got the new defined OR and logical OR operators and signatures. We've got pluggable infix operators. We've got the new module true feature. And we've also got a few deprecations and bits and pieces being tidied up, such as SmartMatch getting deprecated. Looking at this new class syntax in a bit more detail now, this is implementing the very start of a design called Core that was started by Ovid. That was the inspiration for yet another CPAN module called Object Pad, where we took that design and we started actually implementing it. We spent a long time fine-tuning many of the ideas around that, getting a good feel for how to use it in practice. That's been around now for about 4 years, so it's had a lot of use in real-world code, in real systems. We've got to grips with actually using it, and we've got a good feel for what we feel is a good design. And that's why we've started getting around to copying some more of the basic ideas of that into core Perl itself. And I should add, this is only the very beginning. There's still a lot more work to be done yet. And I should also add that a lot of the object system work has been sponsored by an Austrian company called Geizhals Preisvergleich. So I'm very grateful for all of their support in helping me get this into the Perl language up to this point. Now, as this class syntax is still very much an ongoing experiment, before we go on, I would like to put in a brief aside as to what the word experimental really means. Experimental means that it's not a stable, long-term supported feature yet. Experimental doesn't mean, does this thing work? We know it works. We have lots of unit tests, integration tests. We've got lots of code running in real production systems already using this. We know that it technically works. What we don't know is, do we like it? And by we here, I mean you, the users, the people trying to use this. Is this the sort of thing that people actually want to use in their code? Yes, we know it's quite incomplete and there's lots more still to add, but what do we think of it so far? So please give us feedback. Is this the sort of thing that we should be supporting in the language for years to come? What do you like? What do you not like about it? This is the ideal time to be adjusting it and finding the right thing to be writing here. So with that said, let's take a look at an example similar to what's been a lot of the documentation and see what this new syntax looks like. So here we start off with this use feature line that actually turns on the new syntax, and that gives us these three new keywords of class, field, and method. The class keyword here defines a new class called point, which behaves roughly the same as a package. It's really just a package with a few extra bits and pieces. Inside this class, there's a method called describe, which is really just a sub with, again, a few extra bits and pieces. And also these fields, which are quite like regular lexical variables with a few extra bits and pieces on them. It's really very similar to what you would get if you wrote this with just the package, my, and sub keywords instead. If you ignore this param attribute for a second, it looks basically the same. But of course, with a package and my variables, there can only be one copy of the data. This being a class instead of a package, one of the things we get is this constructor method generated for us. It's called new. So we get to call that, and we can get multiple instances of objects in this class. Each of those instances then has its own copy of the field variables, and each can store its own unique values, which is basically what it means to be an object. It's about having a set of behaviors, i.e. its methods, and each object stores its own state, i.e. its fields. And this is basically all you need to write. You don't have to define a constructor, you don't have to call bless, you don't have to use the self-arrow notation to invoke accessor methods just to get at the fields. They're just variables that you can use directly in the methods. There's also a lot more going on with these param attributes and the default values. So these here say that the caller can pass in different values into the constructor to set the fields for each instance, as we've seen over here. And that becomes part of the interface to the class. If a value is missing, then this default value applies instead. It's a nicely compact syntax that altogether manages to convey a lot of meaning and encode a lot of implicit behavior that we don't need to write up front. So instead we can focus on the specifics of our particular use case. So moving on, another new thing in 5.38 is that we now have this choice of a few more operators that can go in signatures. So signatures, as they were in 5.36, have this idea of default values, where the parameter becomes optional. If the caller doesn't provide a value for this parameter, then we get this default of 10 here. How this works under the hood is somewhat similar to this, where we look at the actual count of the values that were passed to see if there was more than one of them. If so, we'll grab the brackets 1 argument, otherwise we'll just take this default of 10. So what that means is that if you call this function with just one argument, you'll get the default of 10 in the y variable, as you probably expect. But if instead you were to pass in a second value of undef, then that's what you get in this y variable, which is possibly not what you wanted to do. And it starts to get worse if you wanted to have two optional arguments with defaulting values. If you were to call this function with just one argument, then you get the defaults for y and z. But what if, for example, you wanted to pass in a different value for z, but keep the default for y? Well, there's no way to do that. You'd have to pass in undef as this hole in the middle. There's nothing else you can do, which means that y ends up being undef. So this becomes a bit more of a problem, and it's a thing that just gets in the way, and you can't get around this. So it gets even worse if you're trying to pass in values from somewhere else. Maybe you have these two scalars with values in, and maybe one of them is undef. You can't just call it by passing in both scalars because of the chance of there being an undef. You have to look and see, is it defined, and do two different things in each case. It gets rather untidy already just with one optional argument. And just like before, it becomes basically impossible if you want to have more than one optional, and if you want to pass in the second without the first, you just can't do it. So new in Perl 5.38, you can now use the defined OR operator to write your parameter defaults instead, which means it now cares about whether or not the caller is passed a defined value or not, rather than just there being any value at all. It behaves a lot more like the sort of code you'd probably have written before signatures, where you'd probably unpack a value out of the arguments list and use the defined OR operator to apply a default value, such as here where we look at the brackets 1 argument, or 10 if it wasn't defined. So now you can just pass in one argument and get the default of 10, or if you pass in undef, you still get the default of 10. You can now just pass in all these variables and it all behaves much nicer. And in the cases where you'd have 3 parameters and 2 were optional, it all behaves much more as expected. And this is really what you probably want to be writing most of the time. Most of the time you don't really care about the presence or absence of these values, but whether or not they were defined or not. It's almost never the case where an actual undef value being present has a different meaning from it being entirely absent. Most of the time when you're applying default values to signature parameters, you probably want to be using this defined OR operator instead. And also for completeness, you can use the logical OR operator instead. So now it cares if the value is true or not, rather than being defined or not. It's not often that you need this, but perhaps sometimes it might be useful, and so it's there as well if you need it. These things also apply nicely to class field parameters as well. Just as with signature parameters, you can also use these operators to define default values for fields and classes. So that means that in the constructor, if you were to pass in an undef, then the default applies over that undef. So it's quite handy for constructing objects when you're just pulling out values from hashes or something like that. That would be very much neater again with something like this KV slice syntax. So now you can write code like this with this KV slice without needing to care if the hash actually contains an X or a Y key. And you just know that the constructor is going to do the right thing with defaults in cases like this. Way back in Perl 5.14, we added these things called pluggable keywords, which is a way that CPAN modules can interrupt the core parser and help to extend the syntax by adding new things, new real keywords with real syntax behind them. And that's been used to great effect by a whole bunch of modules. I've already mentioned some, like syntax keyword try, syntax keyword defer, object pad, but there's a whole lot more of them out there on CPAN. And these are all things that are based around some of these leading keywords like try, defer, class, and so on. Words that introduce new syntax. They've been very useful so far, but sometimes you might want to do something different involving some sort of infix operator notation and define some kind of new operator that can sit between two expressions instead. So in Perl 5.38, we've now added this ability for CPAN modules to define new operators as real infix notation between expressions. So now we have an ability to experiment with yet more kinds of operators that we might someday consider adding to the language. These are accessed via this interface module called XSParsInfix, which acts as a sort of gateway between the new operator modules and the actual Perl core. This is very much like any of the actual keyword modules, which use XSParsKeyword as an interface to the Perl parser. So here's an example of that in action. This is a new operator called EQU, or EQ. This is provided by another CPAN module that we're experimenting with, and it's another string equality operator similar to the regular EQ operator, except that this one can distinguish undef from the empty string. It knows that they're different, and it doesn't print a warning in either case when it's asked to compare them. Now, you might look at this code and wonder why we're doing this when we could just use a defined test here instead. But we'll come back to that in a minute. For now, just hold on to the thought that having a new infix operator is now a thing that we can do, which means that we can wrap up more useful bits of behavior into such infix operators. So also new in 5.38, there's another little convenience when writing module files. You know how whenever you're writing a module file, you need to remember to put the true value at the end of it? Well, this now avoids you needing to do that, and it's all linked back to that use version syntax we looked at earlier. So if you think about the sort of traditional way that you'd lay out a .pm file, you'd start with a package statement, you've got your use strict, use warnings, you then have a bunch of functions and whatever else, the actual content of your module, and then you put this one value at the end. And that's really just a bit of noise, a bit of historic baggage that was useful at one point in time, but honestly, we don't really need it these days. So it'd be nice to tidy that up. Now, as I mentioned earlier with the use version syntax, ever since 5.12, that already implies use strict. So actually, we can just write use v5.12 here instead of strict. And since 5.36, that also implies use warnings as well. So we can get rid of the use warnings line too. Well, new in 5.38, you now don't need to put the true value at the bottom of the module anymore. Whenever any other piece of code loads this module by using require or use, they'll see a true value automatically as a result of you just having put use v5.38. So it avoids you needing to put this extra line at the bottom here. So that's yet more neatness that we can gain as a result of using this use version syntax. Other changes, as I mentioned, the SmartMatch operator is now actually deprecated. SmartMatch, the double tilde operator, was a design that we copied into Perl from, as it was known at the time, Perl 6, that's subsequently been renamed to Raku. And it's a nice design in Raku, but it doesn't really fit into Perl due to the different way that the Perl language goes about doing a few things. And it took us a while to really get to grips with that. So it's hung around for honestly rather too long. But primarily this is really because the type system is a little bit different in Perl than it is in Raku. So in Perl, we have this very loose idea of whether values are numbery or stringy. They're quite often both, really. But that doesn't really matter because we have a lot of operators that distinguish the two whenever we need to know. So, for example, we have this plus operator that looks at two numerical values and adds them together to yield a new number. Or this dot operator that looks at two stringy values and concatenates them to yield a new string. And each doesn't really care what it's given. It looks at those operands and asks, how can I make sense of this value as if it were a number or a string, as the case may be. And likewise, we have these two comparison operators that can ask the questions of, are these two the same number or are they the same string? And both of those work fine here because it's the operators that define the question that we're really asking. They can look at the same two values and come to two different answers, as in the case here. These two values represent the same number, but they don't represent the same string. Now, this causes a problem when we get to the SmartMatch operator, which in Raku guesses what kind of comparison it's trying to make by looking at the types of the values it was given on either side. But we have this problem in Perl because it's not really clear at all whether, when we're looking at these values, whether we're looking at strings or numbers. Are they the same or not? Is this true or false? It isn't clear, it isn't obvious from reading this code what the behavior ought to be here. And it gets worse when we think about not just literals, but actual variables, where these values might come from other parts of the program. They might have been adjusted along the way. And now we get to comparing them. We even have these things called dual vars that can be both numbers and strings at the same time. It's not easy to predict what's going to happen here. And this makes this operator very hard to use. It gets even worse with SmartMatch because it tries to be this fancy do-anything operator that can cope not just with two scalars, but with two of anything on either side. So you can ask if a number matches an array, or a hash, or a code ref, or you can put fancy structures on both sides. It becomes too complicated. There are too many rules. It gets hard to predict. It's hard to use. So we decided a long time ago that we should discourage people from using it, and we've now declared it formally deprecated in Perl 5.38. It's a little bit unfortunate because the SmartMatch operator is also the thing behind the syntax that we have in Perl called give and when, which is a little bit like things like switch case in C or other languages. It's where we say, here is a value, and we want to compare it to ask, does it match any of these other values? And if it matches, then we'll run this block of code. And give and when uses SmartMatch as its way to compare whether the thing actually matches. But because of all these problems with SmartMatch, it makes the syntax hard to use, because now we have to guess, is it going to use number or stringy comparisons, or what else is it going to do? So instead, we've been thinking about this new set of keywords, perhaps some syntax where the programmer specifies up front what kind of comparison operator is being used to match the values against the individual cases. So here in this case, we can see that's definitely going to be numerical match because we're using the double equals operator here. There's no guesswork. It's all declared up front. Now, this has all been an experiment in yet another CPAN module called syntax keyword match. And this is yet another example of where CPAN modules give us the flexibility to play around with new kinds of syntax, new ideas that we might want to bring into the core language. Earlier, I mentioned this new EQU operator, and now you can perhaps start to see why it's a useful thing to have. It combines nicely with this new match case syntax. Because it can compare undef distinctly from the empty string, it becomes more useful to use it this way with match case. So here we have this new operator that's a bit more fancy than EQ, but it doesn't suffer any of the other problems with SmartMatch. So it's a nice middle ground that works well as an operator on its own, as well as when it's combined with this match case idea. Now, we've seen quite a few language changes across recent versions of Perl. Now, many of these have come about as a result of what we call the PPC process for proposed Perl changes. This used to be called the RFC process, which is a thing we were talking about last year. That was renamed PPC to avoid confusion with other things around that are called RFCs, especially things like the IETF. So they're now called PPCs. And this is an actual formal process. We have a spreadsheet that tracks them. We have a bunch of other documentation that describes how to interact with these, how to approach them, how to write new ones. And there were a bunch of these things that went into recent Perls, 5.36 and 5.38. They were actually results of this process. So at 5.36, we added a whole bunch of new features, and about 6 of those came from PPCs. At 5.38, there were 3 of them that came from PPCs. But there's a whole lot more that are still waiting around as accepted but not yet implemented. And there's still many more in discussion that we're hoping to get accepted. So there's plenty more things still to be getting on with. It's an open process, so anyone can submit new ones, take a look at and discuss existing ones, and so on and so forth. They're all stored in GitHub on their own repository. So if you're interested in taking a further look, that's the place to go. And it's very much the overall process for driving big changes in the language. So it's a good thing to become more familiar with if that sounds like something that's of interest to you. So on the subject of onward changes, I thought I'd end by briefly going over a few things that I would like to be doing next. Now, these are very much just my thoughts, my plans. They're not official decisions of the PSC or anything. They're just things that I want to do. So firstly, for Perl 540, I want to continue thinking about the object system and bringing in more ideas from ObjectPad, things like roles and convenience accessors, and generally keep going with just moving more things that seem to be stable ideas out of that CPAN module and into the core language. We're also going to need this meta-programming API, which is a way to interact with things like the class system programmatically, so that you can dynamically create classes, add methods, that kind of thing. But it's also a way to tidy up a lot of existing things that you typically do in the language now, with things like glob refs, or places where you go no strict refs, that kind of thing. It'd be nice to have a better and more readable API for doing these kinds of meta-programming tasks. There's CPAN inspiration here also in the form of modules like package stash. We can gain some ideas from those as well. In Perl 5.36, we added a whole bunch of built-in functions. So it'd be nice to start declaring that at least some of the simpler ones of those are now stable so that they can stop printing experimental ones. And maybe also start to include some of them in the default feature bundles. So perhaps by the time we get to Perl 5.40, you can just use v5.40 and straight away get access to things like the true and false built-ins. We've got a PPC document to add these things called quoted template strings. Now, these are inspired by similar ideas from languages like JavaScript and Python and so on, where the idea is that you can embed arbitrary expressions as interpolations inside of a quoted string, rather than just being restricted to plain variables. It gives you a nice, neat way to embed things like object accessors, where without that, it would have been much more difficult to write. And of course, that's not limited just to accessors, but any expression can sit in there. Whatever expression you put in the braces, that will get interpolated as well. Now that we've got these stable signatures, it'd be nice to keep this feature moving forward as well. One of the things that gets requested from time to time are these named parameters. So these are things that you would declare much like positional parameters. They turn into lexical variables inside the function, as with positional parameters. But from the caller, they're passed in by name using this much more familiar key value syntax that we often use. And also here, it'd be quite nice to be able to use those defined or operators that we saw earlier. Because again, in these kind of situations, you often care more about definedness of the value rather than its just mere existence. And as further ideas, we could start looking into things like the match case syntax or the EQU and the triple equals operators, and similar things like that. Other CPAN experiments that we think might be ready to start supporting the core language itself. Looking further ahead at what might be in Perl 5.42, we might consider things like multiple dispatch on subroutines and methods. And if we're going to start thinking about those, we might want to be looking at something like type assertions or a type system. Now, there's already people looking at that kind of thing already, so perhaps by then we'll want to start seeing what we can bring into the core language as well. And we'll just carry on thinking about whatever other new ideas turn up. And at some point, we might look into renumbering the language up to version 7. Now, if you look back at what was in the original Perl 5.0 and later 5.6, 5.8 and so on, and you compare that to where we are now, the language has really evolved so much since then. And actually, if you compare Perl 4 to the first Perl 5, we are already now looking at a much bigger set of changes than that change was from 4 to 5. So if the additions in Perl 5 were already enough to warrant a major version bump, then I'd say that what we're looking at now, things like signatures, object systems, new operators, that kind of thing, these would quite easily justify yet another major version bump to call it 7. And with that, I think I'm done. Let's see if there's any questions.
Okay. First question. On the attributes that you have on the fields.
Yeah.
Do you get, is that customizable with the modify underscore scalar underscore attributes?
Yes and no. It is extensible. So in ObjectPad, it's very extensible, and there are extra modules on CPAN for just adding more field attributes. But no, it doesn't happen through the same mechanism as existing attributes, because the existing mechanism on code and scalar variables is very flat. It's very limited in what it can do. There's so much that it just doesn't support. So I've designed a whole new, much more powerful mechanism for implementing attributes, and that's currently in the ObjectPad CPAN module. I'm very much intending to pull that into the core Perl implementation, and while I'm there, also attack the way that extension attributes work on everything else, like code refs and variables and so on. So just some random example, as core Perl currently implements it, if you apply an attribute to an anonymous code ref, a closure, no code at all gets run at compile time of the code. And the only bit of code you can hook in is every single time that sub expression gets evaluated, the attribute gets applied to the actual code ref once you've formed the closure. So it means that things like attributes that change the way that the code compiles cannot be currently created. Whereas the way that I've implemented attributes in ObjectPad is that an attribute is defined, it's registered as a name in the core, and then it has a whole bunch of hook functions that run at different times. So you can fiddle with the octree, you can do all these other kinds of things at all these different times, and each one is independent. Whereas the way that modify code attributes currently runs, you get given everything and you have to handle all of them. And if you don't like them, you kind of call to the next one, or maybe it's the superclass or something like that. There's so much about the current implementation that's wrong. So I just decided I'm not going to follow that. I'm going to build a new, better mechanism, and we'll eventually backport that into the way that all attributes work.
All right. Thanks.
So it's a good question. I like that one.
Other questions? Come on, don't be shy.
I'm keeping an eye on Slack as well, but so far there's the comment about having people be there in person. Yeah, it was a bit difficult for me to be there in person this year. I was sort of intending to, but timing of like just around the summer and just so many other things. Like one of the other things I volunteer doing, I run a stage show, and the stage show happens just around this time of the year. So this is literally a really busy time for me.
Sure, then I have a question. I liked the Qt operator actually. And
it's
it
nice.
is sad for me. It doesn't come into 5.38. The question is, who defines what feature goes to which version?
When they're done. I mean, it's basically never ever been the case where we've got a feature that's ready and we go, yeah, that's good, but we won't merge it yet. We'll save it for a later release, right? That doesn't happen, right? But also, so like, as soon as it's done and ready and we can hit that merge button, it'll get merged and then it'll be there. But all of our contributions are volunteer efforts, right? Nobody gets directly paid by Perl for any of this. So we can't dictate to people. We can't say, look, we've got these 10 different features. You've got to work on this one. We just have to work with the contributions that people bring. So we can try to suggest, hey, look, here's a feature. We would like people to work on this. But we've had that sitting around, for months now, and nobody's touched it. So it's like, there's a limit to what we can do to try to encourage these things to happen. We just got to work with what we get.
Thank you, Paul. Any other questions from the room?
So I can't hear that. You'll have to come forward.
Did you say? What put something in the Slack? Paul,
write it down or get someone to relay it up to the stage here.
It is already there.
Oh, let's have a look.
Which channel?
Oh, sorry, I totally missed that line. How compatible objects created with class with other objects created with bless? I mean, they are a whole new kind of thing. So up until Perl 5.36, whenever you want to create objects, you have to create something like a blessed hash ref or a blessed array ref or something. You have to take an existing data structure and then annotate it with blessed to say, by the way, it's a member of that class. But really, it's just a data structure. And then you do self arrow brackets, whatever, to kind of get the data out. These new objects in 5.38 are literally a new kind of data type. They are objects. objects. And this kind of comes back to every time someone says, oh, why couldn't you just put moose in core? Like, no, moose has to work with what's existing in the language. That's all it can do because it's just written in Perl. Whereas Perl itself gets to make the rules for Perl. So these new 538 objects are literally a new kind of thing. They are objects. If you call ref type on it, you will not get hash or array. You will get object. And they are a totally new kind of object. But for any users outside of that actual class definition, nobody really needs to know, right? They're just values that you pass around in variables. You can invoke methods on them exactly the same as you can for any other objects. In terms of things like subclassing, that's not currently a thing at all. So, I don't exactly know what Moose is going to do, but if, for example, you take an existing, a 538 class and you try to subclass it by just going use base, whatever, then yes, you'll have more methods in this subclass, but you won't have access to any way to store data because you can't just treat self as a hash ref or an array ref or whatever. Like, you need the fields. So if you are going to create a subclass of a true class object, you need to be using the class syntax. Now, currently, the same is also true the other way around. If you want to subclass an existing thing, that thing also has to be using the 538 objects. That's largely a limitation of the limited time I actually had to implement it. We just wanted to get something into 538 so that we could ship it. Now, Object Pad, I've had like 3-4 years working on that. Object Pad, at the very beginning, one of the first things we decided was it would be very important to be able to take an existing blessed hash ref or array ref or whatever, some kind of existing older style of Perl class and be able to extend that. So if you use Object Pad, you can just subclass things that are based on literally classical bless or moo or moose or whatever. And we have unit tests that prove, yes, this just works fine. It has always been my intention that at some point the core Perl system will support that, because otherwise you have this problem where you're kind of stuck with an all or nothing. You can't move forward. If you've got an existing set of code, how do you move that forward? Whereas if you were to have that ability to subclass, then you can say, well, I'm going to write a new piece of code using the new syntax, see if I like it. And then gradually, maybe, in a few days' time, if I like that, I will take one of my existing subclasses, change that, kind of change things a bit at a time. And I certainly found in the earlier implementations of Object Pad, that was a really useful thing to be able to do, where I could just say, here's a bunch of code. I'll change a small bit of it to use Object Pad, see if I like it. That will solve this one small thing, and gradually, incrementally change it from there. So perhaps in 540, you will have the ability to do a subclass, a class-based subclass of an existing manually blessed style of class. But currently that doesn't exist yet. But as I say, it's a huge work in progress. We know there's so much more to implement yet.
All right, we have another question from the room.
With a typical hashref-based object, you can dump its state with data dumper. It's very useful for debugging. Is there something similar? What would you do?
No, there isn't. So I always enjoy being asked about data dumper because ultimately the answer is please stop using data dumper. And the reason for that is that data dumper must output valid Perl source code. I don't know of any time that I have ever seen anyone need that feature. Every single time people use data dumper or data dump or anything like that, they are looking at it as a human. There is a far better module for this. It's called data printer. Data printer doesn't have to emit valid Perl source code. So data printer can output things that humans can read. And it can put coloring and if you print an array ref of 10,000 values, by the time you get to 7,000, it can remind you, by the way, the array index is 7,000 here. Loads of little things like that. But crucially, if you have a real object class, those fields are private. You cannot mutate them from outside. This is an important encapsulation safety feature. Now, what that means is if I give you an object, like one of those points, and, X is 2, Y is 5, right? If it's a kind of a security important object, then maybe there is literally no syntax that you could write that could create that. So what could data dumper print for the output? It has to print valid Perl code to reconstruct the value you gave it. But maybe that's impossible. I mean, currently, this problem already massively exists in Perl, because if you try to give a closure, like a code ref, into data dumper and ask it to print, including all the private variables inside it, right? It can't do that. It can't output something that would regenerate it. But normally that's not too much of a problem, because normally people don't tend to give code refs into data dumper and expect it to do something. But people do that with their objects. So very much, there are ways to integrate things like the actual debugger or storable or serial or those kinds of things. You can definitely give those. There are meta functions specifically to say, here's an object, just list me all its fields and get me all the values out of it. And similarly, when serial is reloading stuff, kind of special ways around the object system to say, shut up, I know what I'm doing. I want to reconstruct this object out of this. Like, there are ways to do that, but it's not just casual Perl syntax that you just write a bless call with an add-on hashref or whatever and expect it to just work. It's very much special situational stuff. So to summarize the answer, no, it doesn't work in data dumper, but that's the fault of data dumper.
Okay. But then data print, then it could be made to work with data print.
Yeah, it already does. So, data printer already handles object pad objects. Absolutely fine. It probably should be made to support the core Perl ones. We just haven't got around to writing the code. But that one is just a matter of someone just needs to sit down and write a few more lines of code. That one's not a hard problem.
Okay, great.
I hope I'm going through I'm aware that we've still got 15 minutes, so I'm trying not to be too brief in my answers because we got time to fill.
Any other questions? Okay. Come to the stage.
Yeah, someone on Slack points out the data printer is not in core. Yes, I know, and it damn well ought to be. Because it's a shame. It's almost disgraceful that core Perl doesn't actually have a please print me this value for human debugging purposes. That kind of thing really ought to be in core. Yeah, definitely.
Hey, Paul. My question is, so this morning, Curtis Poe talked a little bit about the roadmap, and he had listed a slide where he listed kind of, we are here, and then below was, I only remember there was, maybe number 5 was MOP, but there were several things underneath where you guys are now. Could you just talk a little bit more about, the more near term and then midterm goals that y'all are working towards right now?
Oh, what, specifically with the class system?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've already got a branch for Bleed Perl. I've not merged it yet because some of the tests fail. To implement the underscore class constant. So you know how you've got the double under package that just gives you the string name of your current package. Well, in Object Pad, we discovered that we need a kind of a special notation. So I didn't really go into detail on the slides earlier, but those field parameters where you give a default, that value doesn't have to just be a constant. That is a true expression that is run as part of every single constructor, every single object constructor. So you can put real expressions in there that calculate values. And those values can be dependent on previous fields as well. So you could do things like have a field where you have the full name of something, and then you can maybe have the short name of it, which is just some string mangling of the first one. And so if nobody provides an override for that, you just calculate it and all this kind of fancy stuff. But one thing that people quite like to be able to do is invoke methods on the class that is currently being constructed to say, here is the default value for this parameter. So that if you have a subclass, you can just provide a different default value for that parameter and stuff like that. But you can't put $self in that expression because the object itself doesn't exist yet. So we need a new thing that looks a bit like a constant, and we've called it double under class, all in capitals, very similar to package. So it gives you just the name of a class, but it won't just be statically the one that the source code's in, because if you make a subclass, you'll see the subclass one, so you can invoke class methods on that. So that's already just about implemented. Relatively soon, I've got a whole bunch of little bugs to fix, just things that didn't quite get shaken out in 5.38. And then fairly soon, I want to start implementing either roles or the convenience accessor generator attributes on fields. But to do that, it sort of means that I have to properly implement in core Perl those new ways to do attributes. So, like, it's a small addition to the class syntax, but it builds upon this huge pile of sand. And so suddenly I have to build up lots of stuff at the base of that to start getting anything new. So roles, convenient successors, and also the meta system, which again, if meta was a thing that already existed, so I talked about that in the slides, if meta already existed, it would be quite easy for us just to add a few extra methods into that for add class, add field, add method, stuff like that. But meta doesn't exist yet. So first we have to create meta, which means we have to get over lots of kind of awkward questions about packages in Perl. And like it turns out in Perl, if you inquire whether a package exists, well, it definitely exists because you've asked the question. So, and just there's lots of little messy things in Perl that mean that creating just meta generally has a whole bunch of annoying questions that just need to be answered. So it's going to be a bit of a long slog to get that one done. But I think between those two, that's probably, that's certainly quite a lot to be getting on with in 5.40. But I don't want to spend too much time doing just the class stuff in 5.40 because I want to get back and do some of the things like the Qt strings and stable built-ins and a whole bunch of other things need attention. Because if you look at 5.36, we added tons of cool stuff in 5.36. And then in 5.38, it's basically, here's the object system, and a sprinkling of a few other little bits and pieces here and there. So I want to get back to doing lots of little features rather than just a huge amount on the class system.
All right. Time is up. Thank you for coming and thank you, Paul. If you have any further questions, post in Slack. Then Paul
I'll be around all evening.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.